Hello. It's really great to be with you all tonight. I've been looking forward to this. The one thing I'd ask is that you not eat while I'm talking. I'm just kidding. Oh man. We're gonna have maybe a little bit of fun. I have some thoughts to share for maybe 20, 25 minutes, and then I'm really looking forward to just opening it up. Answering your questions. We'll have a conversation. I've been asked here today to speak with you about the pro-life cause and our political parties, how the issue of life interacts with our partisan politics. My aim here is not to offer a kind of comprehensive history, but to provide a bit of perspective that might help you as you think about the state of our politics today and why our political parties relate to the issue of abortion in the way that they do. In order to do that, I want to first talk about political parties and the polarization we see today. And the first point I want to make is that our political parties have taken up an unhealthy place in our political imagination. Our political parties have taken up an unhealthy place in our political imagination. According to some metrics, political polarization is at an all-time high. Instead of our values influencing our politics, our political circumstances are shaping our values. As partisans, we tend to explain away the flaws of the candidates we support or the party we support, and we buy nearly any outlandish theory about the candidate we oppose. So there was one survey in January of 2017 that showed that just about as soon as Donald Trump was elected president, Democrats were more likely to believe in conspiracy theories than Republicans. And when Barack Obama was president, it was flipped. Republicans were more tinfoil hat kind of folks. We even changed what we believe to fit the moment. We're all now aware of research that shows how political polarization is no longer a province of the Beltway, but it seeped out into the broader public. It's no longer DC that's sort of taken up in partisan politics. It's our very own communities, our college campuses. Political identity is now reflected in our friendships and romantic lives, where we live and the media we consume. There was a 2008 book by Bill Bishop called The Big Sort, and in that book, Bill contends that Americans are increasingly geographically segregated. So we choose to live in place, and we tend to live in places with people who believe basically the same things that we do. There was a survey in 2014. So in the 1960s, when parents were asked, who would you not want your child to marry? In the 1960s, the answer was, I would not want my child to marry someone of a different religion, and I would not want my child to marry someone of a different race. In 2012, when parents were asked that question, if the parent was a Democrat, they said, I would not want my child to marry a Republican. If the parent was a Republican, they said, I would not want my child to marry a Democrat. It's crazy, right? Although maybe some of y'all are having those conversations with your parents, so, if it's your parent, I didn't mean to call them crazy, but generally it's crazy. So over the last 50 years, we've seen that's an 800% increase in the percentage of Americans who would be upset if their child married someone who belonged to a different political party. Because our parties are so polarized and party identity is so profound, we find that politicians and political parties have inordinate influence over the views of citizens. And so take something like the DREAM Act, for instance. When President Bush was in office supporting the DREAM Act, a much higher percentage of Republicans supported it. Same piece of legislation supported by a Democrat, Republicans' support plummets. We've even seen this affect religious affiliation. So two academics, Robert Putnam and David Campbell, suggest that party affiliation is actually driving religiosity, not the other way around. So if you're a Republican, you're more likely to identify as evangelical, not because evangelicals are Republican, but because Republicans are evangelical, and the same on the Democrats. We have not invested such meaning into what a political party is and what it means to affiliate with one because of the nature of a political party. A political party is just a vehicle to organize the viewpoints and political ideas of the citizenry. It's a mediatory body. It's not a brand. It's not a profile. The party actually has no real control over what you think when you go to the DMV to register for a political party. There's no fine print that says, I hereby sign over my conscience to whatever the party platform says and on this particular date. But the parties are that way because of what is in their interest and in the interest of the other political actors who benefit from them. That is to say, political parties demand our allegiance not because it is their right, but because it is in their interest. We should be members of a political party because we believe things. We should not believe things because we are members of a political party. Does that make sense? So this is relevant to how we consider the issue of abortion and our political parties. Abortion has become a pretty strictly partisan issue, and in part, that's because of the power of partisanship. You know, it wasn't always the case that Democrats were overwhelmingly pro-choice and elected Republicans overwhelmingly pro-life. Daniel K. Williams, who wrote a history of the American pro-life movement, described in his book how the heart of the pro-life movement at its beginning was Catholic, and because of that, democratic. So about a century ago. For much of its history, Williams writes, the fight to restrict abortion was a progressive cause. One reviewer in the New York Times wrote this about Daniel's book, quote, from the perspective of and this is a pro-choice reviewer of Daniel's book, from the perspective of our historical moment, it's hard to imagine a country where the most prominent voices against abortion were Catholic physicians and evangelical Protestants were either in favor of lifting restrictions on abortion or didn't really care. A country where Democrats and the Black Panthers opposed abortion and Ronald Reagan, like most conservatives, supported it. Where more men than women supported legalizing abortion, and Hugh Hefner was one of those men, leading one activist to call legalized abortion the, quote, final victory of the Playboy philosophy. Where opposition to abortion found common cause with opposition to the exploitation of women, to the abandonment of the poor, to big business, and the Vietnam War. Here's a quote from Williams' book where he describes a sort of pivotal moment in 1972, so right before Supreme Court decided on Roe v. Wade. Here's Williams. The media portrayed the pro-life movement as a Catholic cause, but by 1972, that stereotype was already outdated. In Michigan, for instance, the fight against a referendum to legalize abortion was spearheaded by three Protestants, a gynecologist, a white Presbyterian mother, and an African-American woman who was a liberal Democratic state legislator. In Minnesota, the leader of the state's pro-life campaign was a liberal Methodist, whose physician husband was a member of Planned Parenthood. In Massachusetts, one of the leading pro-life activists was an African-American Methodist physician who had been the first black woman to graduate from Harvard Medical School. And even in New York, where Catholics accounted for the vast majority of the movement's activists, there was more religious diversity than the media often acknowledged, partly because Catholics had joined forces with Orthodox Jews. In fact, one of the keynote speakers at the April 16 pro-life rally in Central Park was an Orthodox Jewish rabbi who served as president of the Rabbinical Alliance of America. One of New York City's most vocal pro-life advocates was a liberal Lutheran minister who was best known for his protests against the Vietnam War and his advocacy of civil rights. In the wake of that Central Park protest in April of 1972, New York actually passed sweeping legislation to repeal an abortion law that had passed in New York earlier that was only thwarted by Republican Governor Nelson Rockefeller's veto. Williams reflects on this, and I just want to read you one more quote from Williams' book, where he reflects on sort of why and how a small at once beleaguered Catholic movement managed to create a huge coalition that could really move legislation. He wrote, "If the opponents of abortion had based their opposition merely on religious teaching or the seemingly arcane principles of natural law, it is unlikely that the pro-life cause could have withstood the forces of the sexual revolution, the feminist movement, and the social changes of the 1960s. But because the pro-life revolution, because the pro-life movement grounded its arguments in the language of human value and constitutional rights, it was able to attract a politically and religiously diverse coalition that actually gained strength over time. The pro-life movement succeeded because it drew on the same language of human rights, civil rights, and the value of human life that inspired the struggle for African American freedom, the feminist movement, anti-war protests, and the campaign for the rights of gays and lesbians." Take us further into the 70s. You had politicians like Joe Biden, who told one publication that when it comes to issues like abortion, amnesty, and acid, "I'm about as liberal as your grandmother. I don't like the Supreme Court decision on abortion. I think it went too far." Even into the, Ted Kennedy was pro-life into the 70s. Dick Kephart was pro-life, who ran for president, I think in '88, ran again in 2004. Was pro-life deep into the 1980s. And of course, Bob Casey Sr. Was pro-life. And so major, especially in the Northeast, you had a cohort of establishment Catholic Democrats, sort of blue-collar Democrats in the Northeast that were the heart of the pro-life movement up until about 3/4 of the way into the 20th century. Of course, things changed. In 1976, in the wake of Watergate and the political devastation that caused, Republicans put a pro-life measure into their platform. A lot of sort of research suggests that some leaders in the party thought this was kind of a short-term ploy to win Catholics in that presidential election. But the pro-life movement kind of coalesced behind that platform statement that didn't exist in the Democratic Party platform. And of course, when Ronald Reagan came in 1980, the previously pro-choice governor of California embraced the pro-life message and ran against Jimmy Carter, who had defended Roe v. Wade. And so you had this moment where the only alternative at the presidential level could be found in the Republican Party, and that kind of led to a lasting alliance. But even then, there was still staunch representation of the pro-life cause in both parties. Even Bill Clinton, remember, in 1992, ran for president saying that abortion should be safe, legal, and rare, a message that Hillary Clinton had until basically her run in 2016. President Barack Obama ran in 2008, committing to saying he was open to significant restrictions on abortion, and 5 months into his time in office, gave a speech at Notre Dame where he called for a reduction of abortions in the country. Things have changed, especially since 2010. In 2010, in the wake of the Affordable Care Act and controversies around that, what used to be 36 plus pro-life Democrats in the House of Representatives ended up to what we have now, which is just a handful, really just a few. The Democratic Party has, unfortunately, some in the party have taken the view that outreach on pro-life and sort of nuance on the issue of life won't be reciprocated politically. And so they've doubled down on things like Shout Your Abortion and some of the state laws that we've seen in New York and Virginia. Republicans have, of course, become so dependent on pro-life voters that the link has been inseverable, even if the party hasn't always delivered on some of the highest aspirations and goals of the pro-life movement. So I'm happy to talk about any of that if you have questions about that. Where I want to close is just a few thoughts on the future. The first point I want to make is that this debate is not going anywhere, and you all are a great representation of that. The issue of abortion is one of the most persistently vexing in our politics. One of the sort of least resolvable issues, even with all the Supreme Court sort of decisions that have sort of suggested to be final, even with the churn in our politics, even with our political parties, as I just described, changing so much, this issue has stayed relatively constant in terms of public opinion, especially over the last 30 years. So this issue is not going anywhere. Second, the political parties are fluid. I know at this moment it seems like things are intractable politically, not just on this issue, but just generally, right? But it's important to have a historical view of these things. Parties change all of the time, and they change because of they're ultimately democratic bodies that are responsive to and need the support of the American people. And so think about how that affects your political engagement, how you think about parties. Think about what your vision of the Republican Party, of the Democratic Party could be 15, 20, 25 years from now. The third thing, and this goes back to sort of where I opened, is that the needs of political parties are not our needs. There are people who work for the political parties, and they sort of have to toe the line and sort of pretend as if everything that their party does is right and everything the other party does is wrong. I don't work for a political party. I don't think, maybe some of you do. But even if you're, volunteering for college Republicans or college Democrats or whatever you're doing, I would urge you to remind yourselves that you're there. You participate in political parties to influence them, not for them to influence you. So one of the great sort of witnesses that you could have is no matter where you are, no matter what sort of political environment you find yourself in, you're there to represent your values. If you're a Democrat, what the Democratic Party needs right now are people who identify as Democrat and are willing to challenge that party as a Democrat on the issue of life. Republicans could use some challenging on other issues as well that are tied to the dignity of the human person. The final point I'll make is that young people are the future of a holistic, humble, pro-life movement. Daniel Williams, in his study of why sort of the pro-life movement was so effective and can be so effective, is because the early pro-life activists were there on the ground with people. It wasn't just a theoretical issue for them. It wasn't just a sort of a political talking point. This was something that they lived. This was something that they believed, like really believed. And I would urge you all to really search yourselves to find out why you are pro-life and to be able to articulate that, to be able to stand on it, and to be able to find ways in your life. Yes, the politics is important, but find ways in your life where that expresses itself. That is the future of an effective pro-life movement, and it will be effective because it's real. It's something that's core. It's not just another talking point. It's not something that you could evade by just sort of taking a political posture. And so with that, I'll close my remarks, and I'm happy. I think we probably have 20, 25 minutes. Happy to answer any questions about my remarks or anything else, my time in D.C., but really I'm just happy to be here with you. Thank you so much. Great.
All right, we've got a few questions submitted through the app. Number one, what do you think has caused party lines to shift regarding abortion? What caused it to no longer be a progressive cause?
Yeah. Is there a name or anything associated with it, or are they all anonymous questions?
Good question. There is. I don't know if I can find it. Found it. Jordan, over there.
Hey, and where are you from? From Houston. Okay, cool. A lot goes into it. I mean, I covered, part of it was just a matter of political circumstances of when Roe hit in 1973, what the political parties sort of needed, the fact that sort of the feminist movement was bound up in the sexual revolution, and that was located primarily in the Democratic Party, and so abortion just in 1976, when that presidential election came along, and one of the parties for the first time took a national stand, it just ended up there, and then the political coalition sort of formed around that. I mean, there are a whole bunch of different historical approaches. There are some people who say that the legacy of the civil rights movement kind of presented a cleavage that led the parties to sort of orient and relate to abortion in a different way. And then, of course, you have, during the history of evangelical political engagement in this country is a mixed one. There were seasons where the sort of most evangelical way of engaging in politics was sort of a withdrawn approach. But because of the moral majority, because of some of the actions that took place during the 60s and the 70s, evangelicals sort of returned to politics in an organized way at a time when this issue hit. I think more recently, and I alluded to it a bit, the influence of money is significant. And so when you have interest groups, advocacy groups that are spending record amounts of money in order to hold parties accountable and sort of support politicians who support their view on this question, and to undermine politicians who don't support their view in both political parties, that can reinforce things. It's part of why it's so important that we don't allow, particularly when we talk about abortion on the Democratic side, that we don't let sort of Democratic Party branding to sort of take our own view away. There are tens of millions of pro-life people who are Democrats now. Part of the problem is they just don't express it. They're quiet. There's also the issue of, there's a matrix of issues, and if your voting rights are sort of under attack, if your sort of ability to feed your family is on the line, then abortion gets lost in sort of the issue matrix. Then, of course, so there's a lot there. There are many reasons. I think what I make the case for is that nothing is sort of inevitable, and nothing in politics has to stay the same. Things can change. Governor John Bel Edwards in Louisiana signed probably the most aggressive pro-life law in the country. He was just reelected. I will say, if you're pro-life, Governor Edwards should be guarded, to the utmost. Dan Lipinski, he's getting primaried in his Democratic primary. If you're someone who thinks that the Democratic Party should be more pro-life, one way to start is to make sure that the few who have been willing to take tough votes don't get weeded out of the party infrastructure. Yeah, thanks.
Meg asks, how can I influence my political party other than through just my vote?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think you'd be surprised the impact that you could have in your local party. So I'll give you an example. I was I was in, well, I won't get too specific, but I was in an early primary state, and I was speaking at a college in town, but the local Democratic Party, they heard I was coming to town, and it's the most conservative, it was the county Democratic Party in the most conservative part of the state. And they asked me to come and speak. And I was invited by the chair of the local Democratic Party, the vice chair, and I went there, and there were mixed views on this question of life. What I found interesting was all it took was a little bit of encouragement, a little bit of saying, you know, the National Party has its stance, for instance, calling for repeal of the Hyde Amendment in the 2016 platform for the first time. The Hyde Amendment is what bans federal funds going towards abortion. In 2016, the Democratic Party for the first time called for repeal of that in the party platform. But the local political parties feed up to the platform committee. There's no reason why a local party has to co-sign that. No reason at all. They could send a minority report up to the national party and say, this is too far. We don't want that. And by the way, Democratic women are just about split on the question. Democratic women are just about split on the question, 41 to 39%, just slightly in favor of repealing the Hyde Amendment. So why is this part of the national party platform if even our own party is so split on the question? Well, part of the reason is because there's not enough institutional mass within the Democratic Party to represent these views. You look at other debates in the Democratic Party where there is institutional mass, like, for instance, trade. And the same platform where the Hyde Amendment was, where the call for the repeal of the Hyde Amendment was on the 2016 platform, that same platform said that basically the party was agnostic on the question of the Trans-Pacific Partnership trade deal. Because we had an institutional effort, there was a candidate, Bernie Sanders, who ran against the deal. There were moneyed, financed grassroots operations within the party that sort of pushed back on that. And so what was the signature foreign policy goal of the sitting president of the United States was deemed to be like a debatable issue in the party platform. Just 20 years ago, 16 years ago, abortion was the same way. The 2000 Democratic platform explicitly welcomed pro-life Democrats into all levels of the Democratic Party. Explicitly, you can look it up. In 2008, the party explicitly called for a reduction of abortion. It seems like this interminable, like it's only been since 2014, 2013, where the party's taken this sort of no-holds-barred, sort of unequivocal, rhetorical approach on abortion. How that changes is people speak up. People say, this isn't the party I want to belong to. This isn't the party, this isn't the Democratic Party at its best. I tend to think that because the nation is so split on this question, that in the short term, we're always going to have a pro-choice party, and I think that there's some health, some health to that, or at least some health to making pro-lifers like myself, like you in this room, answer the difficult questions, because there are difficult questions here. And so there's going to be a pro-choice party. The question is, can we have two parties that are closer to the middle, or do we have to have a political system in which each election, it sort of feels like everything rides on that election? And you can do activism on your campuses. Again, you can participate in your local political parties. If you have the opportunity, if you live in, I'm not sure about the state regulations here. I'm not sure if you're able to vote in the other if you're only allowed to vote in a primary if you're registered for that party. But in many states, if there's a pro-life Democrat running, if you're not a Democrat, you could vote in that primary just to support pro-life candidates wherever they are.
How do you get involved at a grassroots level, explaining, how to submit a platform resolution at a precinct meeting and change the party in that way?
Yeah, I mean, the most important thing is, well, a few things. One is just to show up. So, right, like you're not going to show up to the first meeting and be like, "Hey guys, I'm here to change things," and so like you have to build trust. You have to build relational capital. You have to be a leader. You have to show that that you have real commitments and engage in persuasion, that kind of thing. Then I'd say, like, being a part of, I think often in politics we think that the options are either sort of do it by ourselves or sort of work in politics. Working in politics is fine. There is a sort of middle way, and that is supporting the people who do direct advocacy work, who are in politics. And so there's an array of pro-life organizations, many with sort of different, depending on your politics, that come at it from a different kind of perspective. Donate time with them. See how you could join up with the advocacy efforts they're doing. I mean, like you're all doing, this weekend. Like, this is a great example of how you could channel your political activism in a way that isn't just isolated, but actually joining your voice with others. And that's the most effective thing. I wouldn't, people are often surprised. Don't underestimate what you and 5 friends, 10 friends can accomplish. You'd be surprised how, especially with your own elected officials, and the more local you go, the more effective you could be. But even your local member of Congress in the House of Representatives, you'd be surprised how rarely they hear from actual constituents of theirs. And if they hear from you and 9 of your friends on the same issue, that's something that will rise up to their notice. That's something that will rise up to the notice of their top staff, that they have constituents that are attentive to these issues. And so don't always feel like you have to change the world, sort of have a movement. Sometimes it's just doing what you can with what you have and building from there.
All right. How can pro-life Democrats fight against the abortion litmus test that is being implemented throughout the party? And this question is from Jordan, but not the same Jordan.
Different Jordan. So it's part of it is kind of what I said before: speaking up, identifying yourself as a Democrat, especially when key moments happen. So, look, I could tell you from my experience in government, if politicians are only hearing from one side, if we on this issue or on any other decide that sort of the other party isn't worth engaging, then they have no input that would lead them to moderate. So for instance, I have I wrote a book called Reclaiming Hope, and that book covers a whole range of controversial issues, including there's a chapter on abortion. And I thought, these chapters on abortion, these controversial issues will be, the things that really get attention and rile people up. The thing that upset people the most, especially when I went on college campuses, was I have 2 paragraphs where I talk about political independence. And the basic argument I make is that political independence are actually not having the effect they often claim to have, which is that they're sending a message to the political parties that you better shape up because sort of you don't have the honor of my presence in your party. The argument I make in my book is that actually when you become a political independent, it means that the parties can't hear you. We have the highest percentage of political independence that we've ever had as a country right now. 43% of Americans are political independents. A plurality, that means more Americans are political independents than are in either of the political parties, either one of the political parties. What that means is not that like if we were going to see the parties sort of, oh gosh, Jesse, we can't lose you. We really have to change. We don't want you to be an independent. If that was going to be the effect, we'd see it by now. 43% of Americans are independents. Instead, what's happening is that if you choose to leave both political parties, and we have a two-party system in this country historically, maybe we're in such a period of disruption that could change, but I think we should operate on the assumption that our national political leaders are going to be elected through one of the two parties, and most of the politics is going to be channeled through the two parties. The message that what's happening is that when you decide to check out of the political parties because you don't agree with every position they have, that, like, my conscience won't allow me to be a part of a political party, they don't really fit me personally, you're actually removing any incentive for the political parties to be moderate at all. Instead, what you have is political parties full of only true believers, people who subscribe to every jot and tittle of the party platform, and that's we lose sort of energy, we lose sort of the ability to moderate, so that it's only on an issue like trade or where there's a big sort of internal party scuffle where you have parties taking less than the extreme position. And so we need to change that. I'd love to see a revitalization of political independence, joining the parties, not because they love them, not because they want to have a elephant or a donkey stamped on their forehead, but because that's how politics gets done, and because they want to join a party to influence a political party, not to have that party influence them. We need more independence in the political party system. So that's one huge way it will change. And then I just say, elected officials need to hear from, well, actually, it's a great example. There was, I'm blanking on his name, but there was a Christian guy that ran for governor in the state. Someone may know his name. Presbyterian guy, ran in the primary. He didn't win the primary because he had a quote that he was like personally pro-life, that he had pro-life views, and the party there was a huge debate in the party, and sort of no one stuck up for him, even though we know that there are millions of pro-life Democrats in the state. And that's kind of what needs to happen. There's a huge debate in the Democratic primary for this presidential election around Joe Biden and the Hyde Amendment. Joe Biden supported the Hyde Amendment. He even supported it in 2012, deep into his presidency. It wasn't until it came up on the campaign trail in 2020 that there was a 48-hour window where there was a debate about whether he was, it became a point of controversy, and then it was sort of what was he going to do. My sense is his campaign heard from a whole bunch of people who wanted him to change his position and didn't hear from too many who were saying, hold your ground, we'll be there to support you, we'll organize this for you, you're not going to be, the bottom's not going to fall out for you. And so when there are these moments, these decision points, look, politicians are they're not complicated. Politicians respond to incentives and disincentives. If you support politicians when they do something right, they will do right more often. If you're silent when they do right, they are less likely to do right. That's just like the nature of politicians. If there was nothing to be gained by taking a position, fewer politicians are going to take that position. And so we need to recognize that and organize around that.
Sandra asks, how can we turn the Democrat Party back to its original pro-life stance?
Look, there's no roadmap there. I mean, I think it's going to. I think a more reasonable goal in the short term is supporting a party that no longer makes Hyde part of its platform, a party that is no longer pursuing laws like we saw in Virginia and New York, a party that reopens itself to restrictions on abortion that 80% of the public agrees on. And then you build from there. I mean, it's going to take people. It's going to take people. And so if all of the pro-life people are joining the Republican Party, the Republican Party is definitely going to, at least sort of in rhetoric, be more beholden. But that also drains sort of that influence from the Democratic Party, and that's like a choice to make. I'm not sure. Like the chief aim of the pro-life movement should be to turn the Democratic Party pro-life. I mean, I think that's to have your eye on the wrong ball. Would it be helpful if there were more visible pro-life Democrats? Absolutely, and that goes back to what we said earlier. Like the baseline is supporting the ones who exist. Like y'all should be busing up to Illinois during Dan Lipinski's primary to make sure he doesn't lose. Y'all should be not just sort of equivocating on John Bell Edwards' re-election. Y'all should be giving him awards and talking about the fact that, pro-life fundraising is going to be sent his way because of the sort of courageous stances he's taken. I mean, that's the way you build. There has to be some source of political influence that goes to Democrats who are pro-life. That's how you build political power.
Since you believe abortion shouldn't be a partisan issue, or if you believe abortion shouldn't be a partisan issue, do you think that it's possible to see it ended by bipartisan action?
I mean, that's what happened. I mean, it wasn't a complete ban, but that's how, well, first of all, that's how most change happens in America. Second of all, that's how we've seen legislation in Louisiana pass. That's how we've seen a lot of pro-life legislation pass, and it's usually more durable that way. And this isn't just about abortion, but really anything. When legislation passes on a party line vote, it makes it really easy to become sort of a partisan, partisan weapon, so that when the other party goes in, they try and undo everything the other party did. And so, like I said before, I'm not sure it should be a goal of the North Star of the pro-life movement to have a pro-life Democratic Party. I think that's some degrees off. But in making sure that politicians are entering in good faith negotiations with Democrats, trying to secure some Democratic support for pro-life legislation, even if that means you only get 90% of what you wanted as opposed to 100%. In my view, that's worth it, because you're actually helping to ensure that your gains are more durable rather than just sort of a partisan victory.
All right, we've got a few more minutes, so I think this will be the last question.
Great.
What was it like working in the Obama administration, especially since he's often cast in poor light in Republican and evangelical circles? And how did he view and handle matters of faith? This is from Catherine.
Cool. Well, look, first it was just an incredible honor. Part of that was, of course, working for him, but also, I worked in the White House Office of Faith-Based Neighborhood Partnerships, and I was pretty optimistic about the faith community going in, and thought churches did a lot of good work. I was more optimistic when I left. Yeah, there were tough moments. Yeah, you meet some characters. But every day I got to work with people of faith who were serving their communities in relatively quiet ways, and we just tried to come alongside them and help them. I was there for the first term, and worked with the president on the Notre Dame speech and the follow-up through that. And I think significant pro-life gains were made. And if by pro-life you mean fewer abortions. I'm an adoption advocate. I'm adopted. I think adoption is beautiful and important, and I think kids need a safe, loving, permanent family. We made President Obama sign the adoption tax credit into law, so it's permanent. So what happened prior to President Obama signing that legislation, how the adoption tax credit used to work, at least for a while, was, I don't know if y'all will be sort of familiar with this, but especially during the Obama years, they wouldn't sign the tax bill until like the end of the year. And then people would figure out what the tax rates were going to be and what credits were available for taxes that year. And so why that's problematic for adoption is you could incur adoption expenses throughout the year, but you wouldn't know until Congress got their act together to actually pass it to know if the adoption tax credit was going to be there for you when you filed. That's obviously like a huge disincentive for parents who want to, prospective adoptive parents who want to enter the process, because if you don't have the money to do it, and if you can't risk Congress not sort of coming through with the adoption tax credit, you just won't begin the process. You just financially can't. But now that tax credit is permanent and families can rely on it. And then when we left office, we'll see, and this is definitely, part of a larger sort of confluence of trends, but when President Obama left office, the abortion rate in this country was the lowest it's been since Roe v. Wade. And I think, whether you support him or not, no matter, obviously state laws had something to do with that. Obviously, the lowering of the teenage pregnancy rate had something to do with that. But regardless of sort of where the political credit goes, it's something worth celebrating. And so on this issue, on so many others, on human trafficking, we could talk about that. It was an honor to work at the White House, not just with the president, not just with the staff there, but with community of advocates and people who serve others across the political spectrum. It was a joy. All right. Hey, thank you. I hope you enjoy the rest of your time here. Thank you for the work that you're doing. Thank you for the message you're bringing on your campuses. Thanks for the way that you're engaging. And I wish you all the best. Thank you very much.